A silver Lincoln idling at the curb of the wealthiest street in town. A lone black man behind the wheel. Checking his phone. Glancing up at the house, numbers. Officer Wade Pruitt saw a burglar casing a target. What he refused to see, even after the man calmly produced a federal photo identification, was that he had just put his hands on a sitting judge of the United States Court of Appeals, and that by midnight, the full weight of the federal judiciary's protective service would be parked outside his own police station. Cedar Hollow sat on the northern curve of Lake Iredell, a town of 6,000 people that had spent the last 20 years quietly reinventing itself from a fading mill community into a boutique lake destination for retirees and second-home buyers from 3 states over. The old part of town still had its hardware store and its diner with the cracked vinyl booths. But the lakefront, lakeshore estates, with its cedar-shingled houses and private docks, belonged to a different Cedar Hollow entirely. One with property values that had tripled in a decade and a police department that had learned, quietly and efficiently, how to monetize the gap between the two. Chief Roy Kessler had run the Cedar Hollow Police Department for 11 years. And in that time he had built something his predecessors would not have recognized as policing at all. Traffic stops on the county road that fed into lakeshore estates. DUI checkpoints timed to catch weekend boaters coming back from the marina bars. And, most lucrative of all, an aggressive civil asset forfeiture program that let the department seize cash, boats, and vehicles from anyone who couldn't afford or didn't have time to fight it in court. The seized property went, more often than not, to Hutchins Towing and Salvage, owned by Kessler's cousin, Bo Hutchins, who auctioned it off and kicked a percentage back through an arrangement nobody had ever bothered to write down. Officer Wade Pruitt was 41 years old, a 15-year veteran of the department, and by his own accounting long overdue for a promotion that kept somehow going to younger men with cleaner complaint files. He had 6 citizen grievances sitting in a folder in Kessler's bottom drawer, none of them ever reaching the town council, because the county's police benevolent fund had a retainer lawyer who made complaints disappear the way Bo Hutchins made vehicles disappear. Pruitt had learned, over those 15 years, exactly how far he could push a stop before anyone with the power to stop him would bother to ask questions. In Cedar Hollow, the answer had always been pretty far. It was a Thursday evening in late September. The kind of dusk where the lake went, the color of hammered pewter, and the crickets started up in the reeds along the shoreline. Pruitt sat in his cruiser at the mouth of Lakeshore Drive, engine idling, air conditioning humming against the last heat of the day. Beside him, in the passenger seat, sat Officer Dana Whitlock, 24 years old, 8 months out of the academy, still learning what the department called the Cedar Hollow way, and still not entirely sure she liked the taste of it. "Watch this one," Pruitt said, nodding toward a silver Lincoln Continental idling near the corner of Lakeshore and Birch. Behind the wheel sat a black man in his late 50s, dressed in a charcoal suit with his tie loosened, looking down at his phone and then back up at the house numbers along the block. "He's probably just lost," Whitlock said, "or looking for an address, or casing the place." Pruitt said, "You don't see a lot of," he stopped himself. She chose a different word. "You don't see a lot of out-of-towners parked on this street after dark, checking numbers on their phone. Something's off. Let's go find out what." Whitlock didn't argue. She had learned, in 8 months, that arguing with Pruitt in the moment never worked. It only got logged against her later as an attitude problem. She watched instead, quietly, the way she'd started watching everything Pruitt did since her 3rd week on the job, inside the Lincoln. The Honorable Marcus Ellison was not lost, and he was not casing anything. He was tired in the specific, bone-deep way that comes after a 14-hour day spent finalizing a 40-page opinion for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 12th Circuit. and he was double-checking the address of the lake house he and his wife had closed on 3 weeks earlier. Because the movers were coming Saturday, and he wanted to walk the property himself before then. He was 56 years old. Silver-templed. Built with the compact economy of a man who still ran 4 miles most mornings before the rest of the world woke up. He had sat on the federal appellate bench for 9 years. Before that, he had spent a decade as a line prosecutor and then a trial judge, which meant he knew, with total clarity, exactly what a pretextual stop looked like from either side of the glass. He didn't see the cruiser pull up behind him until the lights came on, washing red and blue across his rearview mirror. He set his phone down in the cup holder, put both hands on the wheel, and waited. Pruitt approached the driver's side with his flashlight already up. Though the streetlights along Lakeshore Drive were more than bright enough to see by, he rapped the light hard against the window glass, 3 sharp cracks, and Ellison rolled it down without flinching. "Evening," Ellison said. His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who had spent a career making sure every word he said on the record could withstand being read back to him. "License and registration," Pruitt said, skipping past any explanation for the stop. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "Officer, you were parked in front of a residence. Checking house numbers. That's suspicious behavior in this neighborhood." Pruitt's flashlight beam stayed fixed on Ellison's face. "License and registration." "Now." Ellison reached slowly for his wallet, narrating the movement, the way he had, once upon a time, instructed young prosecutors to advise their clients to do. "I'm reaching into my breast pocket for my wallet." He handed over his license and the Lincoln's registration. "I own a property 3 houses down. I was confirming the address before the movers arrived this weekend." Pruitt studied the license without really reading it. "You own a house on this street?" "I do. Closed 3 weeks ago." "You got proof of that?" "I have the closing documents at the house. I'm renting 2 miles from here." "Not in this car. I'd be glad to show you at another time. Or you're welcome to verify the deed with the county recorder, which I imagine is a phone call away even at this hour." Given the department's evident diligence, there was something in the calm precision of the sentence, the faint, cutting edge under the courtesy that Pruitt did not like at all. He had spent 15 years reading fear in the faces of the people he pulled over, and this man's face held none. That absence itched at him like a burr under a saddle. "Step out of the vehicle," Pruitt said. Whitlock, standing near the passenger door, felt her stomach drop. "Wade," she said quietly. "There's no cause here." He gave you a straight answer. "Step out of the vehicle." Pruitt repeated, louder, ignoring her, his hand drifting down to rest on the strap of his holster. Ellison looked at the hand on the holster, looked at the young officer's uncertain face on the other side of the car, and made a calculation that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the physics of the moment. A dark residential street. 2 officers. One of them agitated, and no witnesses beyond a rookie who was clearly out of her depth. He opened the door and stepped out. He was 6 feet even. Still fit. Dressed in a suit that had cost more than Pruitt's monthly mortgage payment. And something about the sheer unbothered composure of the man standing on the sidewalk made Pruitt feel, in a way he could not have articulated and would not have admitted, smaller than he was used to feeling on a traffic stop. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. I want it on the record that I am complying under protest, and that I have committed no offense," Ellison said, turning slowly. Palms open, empty, raised to shoulder height before he set them on the roof of the car. "I am a federal officer of the court. I have identification in my inner jacket pocket that I would like permission to retrieve." Slowly, so there is no misunderstanding. "I'll get it myself." Pruitt shoved Ellison's shoulder against the car harder than the movement required and patted him down roughly, yanking his suit, jacket open. He found the slim leather case in the inner pocket and pulled it out. Flipping it open, one-handed, the gold seal of the United States courts caught the streetlight. Beneath it, a photograph of Ellison in a dark robe, and the words, "The Honorable Marcus. Ellison Circuit, Judge United States Court of Appeals for the 12th Circuit." Whitlock, standing close enough to see it over Pruitt's shoulder, felt the blood drain out of her face. "Wade," she said, her voice suddenly very small. "Wade, look at that." Pruitt looked at it, and then, because some men, faced with proof that they have badly misjudged a situation, do not retreat, but instead dig in harder, as if sheer stubbornness could retroactively make them right, he closed the case and shoved it into his own pocket. "Anybody can print a card," Pruitt said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You're being uncooperative on a legitimate stop. Hands behind your back." "Officer Pruitt." Ellison said he had read the name tag the moment the man stepped out of the cruiser. The way he read every name that mattered in a room. "Out of 30 years of professional habit, I am asking you, clearly, and for the record, to stop this before it becomes something you cannot undo. I am a sitting federal judge. That identification is real. You are one decision away from a very serious problem. Save it for the magistrate," Pruitt said, and wrenched Ellison's arms behind his back. The cuffs went on tight enough to bite. Ellison did not resist. He had spent enough years on both sides of a courtroom to know exactly what resistance would cost him on a dark residential street with an agitated officer holding a weapon, and he had a great deal more to lose by dying correct than by living compliant. They put him in the back of the cruiser. Whitlock stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before she got in, staring at the darkened windows of the house 3 doors down the house. She would later confirm in about 4 minutes, flat on her own phone, that public county records showed had indeed closed to a Marcus and Renata Ellison exactly 22 days earlier. "Wade," she said, sliding into the passenger seat, her voice tight. "The deed's public record. I just pulled it up. He owns that house. Then he can explain that to Judge Sadler," Pruitt said, pulling away from the curb. Hesiav said, already rehearsing in his head the report that would make this stop sound reasonable. He did not yet understand, would not understand for several more hours, that he had just done something no amount of careful paperwork could undo. In the back seat, Marcus Ellison sat with his wrists aching in the cuffs, his suit jacket torn slightly at the shoulder seam, and closed his eyes. He took 4 slow breaths. The same breathing exercise he had once, in another life, taught himself to use in the seconds before delivering a verdict he knew would be unpopular. When he opened his eyes again, they were perfectly calm, and perfectly, coldly focused. Cedar Hollow's police station occupied a squat brick building at the edge of downtown, built in the 1970s and never meaningfully updated since, though the evidence room in the back had, over the last decade, become considerably more full than the modest budget of a 6,000-person town should have accounted for. It was a quiet Thursday night, and the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Otis Grubbs, looked up in mild surprise as Pruitt walked a handcuffed man in a torn charcoal suit through the booking doors. "What've we got?" Grubbs asked. "Suspicious behavior. Resisting," Pruitt said. "Casing houses on Lakeshore." Ellison said nothing. He had learned, decades ago, that the time to speak was not when the room was hostile, but when the room was listening. He stood at the booking counter, cuffed hands in front of him now. "Back straight," and waited. "Empty your pockets," Grubbs said. "I am entitled to 1 phone call." Ellison said, "And I am advising you now that if I do not check in with my chambers within the hour, calls will begin coming to this department that you will not enjoy answering." Grubbs glanced at Pruitt. who shrugged and walked off toward the break room, already composing the incident report in his head, already deciding which details he would soften and which he would leave out entirely. "You get your call after processing," Grubb said. Not unkindly, he was, in his own tired way, simply doing his job the way it had always been done in this building, and led Ellison back to a holding cell. Ellison sat on the metal bench, hands now free, and waited exactly 11 minutes by his own internal count before Officer Whitlock appeared at the bars, glancing over her shoulder toward the front office. "Sir," she said quietly, "I checked the deed. You do own that house. I don't know why he kept going after that. What's your name?" "Officer Whitlock. Dana Whitlock." "Officer Whitlock. I need my phone call. And I need it now. Not after processing." She hesitated for exactly as long as it took her conscience to finish the argument with her career, then walked to the front desk, picked up the wireless handset, and brought it back to the cell without a word to anyone. Ellison did not dial a lawyer. He dialed a number he had memorized the week he was confirmed to the bench, a number that existed for exactly this kind of night. "Judicial Security Division. This is Deputy Marshal Odom. This is Circuit Judge Marcus Ellison. Verification code Delta 619er. A pause. The click of a keyboard. Code verified. Your Honor. Sir. Your device pinged an emergency beacon 11 minutes ago from a fixed location in a pause, Cedar Hollow. Are you in danger? I am currently detained in a holding cell at the Cedar Hollow Police Department. I was subjected to an unlawful stop, physically restrained, and taken into custody after producing valid federal identification, which the arresting officer confiscated and refused to credit. I need the district's marshal's office notified immediately, and I need this logged as a judicial security incident. Not a courtesy call." The pause on the other end lasted 2 full seconds. "Sir, they cuffed you after you showed ID affirmative. Get me Supervisory Deputy Marshal Grace Odom, if she's on shift, and notify the Chief Judge's office that I may be delayed for tomorrow's calendar. Bien Odom." "Sir, I'm activating the protective response team now. Sit tight." "Your Honor, we're coming. 40 miles away. At the district's federal building. Supervisory Deputy, U.S. Marshal Grace Odom was 3 hours into a night shift and had exactly 1 gear when the words "Judicial Security Incident" came across her desk, full speed. She had spent 19 years protecting federal judges from threats that ranged from anonymous letters to men with rifles outside courthouses. And in all that time she had never once had to protect one from the police department of a town that size. "Wake the on-call AUSA," she told the junior deputy at the next desk, already reaching for her jacket. "And get me 2 response vehicles and a duty attorney from Civil Rights. We're rolling on Cedar Hollow." "Ma'am, that's a local PD holding cell. You want federal marshals rolling on a municipal station. I want us standing in that lobby within the hour," Odom said, checking her weapon. Somebody in that department just put hands on a sitting circuit judge and locked him in a cell after he showed federal ID. That is not a jurisdictional grey area. That is an emergency. She called the district's chief judge herself from the road, laid it out in 4 flat sentences, and by the time she reached the outskirts of Cedar Hollow, 2 more Marshals service vehicles and an FBI civil rights unit had joined the convoy, blue and red light bars carving through the dark of the county road like a slow-moving storm front. Back in the holding cell, Ellison sat with his eyes closed. Running through the calculation, he always ran in moments like this, not anger, which was useless, but the precise legal architecture of what had just happened to him. Brigby brick. The way he built an opinion. Unlawful stop without articulable suspicion. Seizure of valid federal credentials. Detention despite verified identity. False statement. In an incident report already being drafted 40 feet away, he did not need to raise his voice. The law would do the raising for him. The rumble reached the station before the lights did a low vibration that rattled the coffee mugs on Sergeant Grubb's desk hard enough that he set down his crossword and walked to the front window. What he saw through the glass made him go very still. 3 black SUVs and 2 armored transport vehicles rolled into the small parking lot, blocking every possible exit with the unhurried precision of people who had done this 100 times and never once needed to think about it. Federal agents in tactical vests fanned out along the perimeter without a raised voice among them. The front doors of the station opened without anyone touching them first, propped by an agent's boot. And Supervisory Deputy Marshal Grace Odom walked in first tall, silver-haired at the temples despite being barely 50, with the kind of stillness that made rooms go quiet on their own. Behind her came an FBI civil rights attorney named Priya Nandan, carrying a leather folio, and 4 more deputy marshals in tactical gear. "I am Supervisory Deputy United States Marshal Grace Odom," she announced, and the words filled the small lobby, the way a foghorn fills a harbor. "I am here for Circuit Judge Marcus Ellison." Officer Pruitt came out of the break room mid-bite on a sandwich, and the sandwich simply stopped being interesting the moment he registered the tactical vests, the SUVs through the glass. The sheer physical fact of federal law enforcement standing in his lobby at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. "What is this?" he said, and it came out much smaller than he intended. Odom closed the distance in 5 unhurried steps. "Are you the officer who arrested Judge Ellison? This is a local matter." He was acting suspicious. He refused to cooperate. "He showed you federal identification," Odom said, "and you took it. Where is it now?" Pruitt's hand went, unthinking, to his own jacket pocket, where the leather ID case still sat. He said nothing, which was answer enough. "I watched the whole thing," said a voice from near the filing cabinets, and every head turned toward Officer Dana Whitlock, who had been standing there for the last 20 minutes, with her arms crossed tight over her chest, working up to exactly this sentence. He showed the ID at the scene. Officer Pruitt looked at it, saw what it was, and arrested him anyway. "I confirmed the property deed myself before we even left the neighborhood. Judge Ellison did nothing wrong." Dana Pruitt started. "No," she said, and her voice cracked, but held. "I'm done covering for how this department does things." Priya Nandan opened her folio on the booking counter with the crisp finality of a woman laying down a winning hand. "Officer Pruitt, you have unlawfully detained a sitting federal appellate judge, seized his identification, and falsified a report claiming resistance where none occurred. Based on Officer Whitlock's account, and what I expect your own body camera will confirm within the hour. That is a federal matter now. Regardless of what jurisdiction you believe you're standing in." Sergeant Grubbs was already moving down the hallway with his keys, not waiting to be told twice. The cell door screeched open, and there sat Judge Marcus Ellison, jacket torn, wrists faintly bruised, sitting with a stillness that made the small concrete room feel, for a moment, like the most orderly place in the building. Deputy Marshal Odom stopped at the bars and, for the first time that night, allowed something like relief to cross her face. "Your Honor, my apologies for the delay. Good to see you, Deputy Marshal," Ellison said, rising slowly, rolling one shoulder where the jacket seam had torn. "I take it, my beacon did its job." "It did. Sir, we're going to need that identification back. And we're going to need a few words with this department before we leave." Ellison stepped out of the cell and looked, for a long moment, at Officer Dana Whitlock, who stood rigid by the filing cabinets, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Officer Whitlock, sir, I should have stopped it sooner. I'm sorry. You told the truth in a room that didn't want to hear it. Ellison said, "That is a harder thing to do than most people ever have to find out. Don't let tonight convince you it wasn't worth doing." She nodded. Unable to answer, he turned toward Pruitt, who stood pale and silent near the break room door. The leather ID case still sitting uselessly in his pocket, like a stone he couldn't put down. "You had it in your hand?" "Officer Pruitt," Ellison said quietly, "the truth was in your hand. And you chose not to look at it because looking at it would have meant admitting you were wrong about a man before he'd said a word. That is not a policing failure. That is a character failure. And character failures do not stay contained to one traffic stop." Pruitt opened his mouth and found, for the first time in 15 years of talking his way through complaints, that he had absolutely nothing to say. Chief Roy Kessler arrived at the station 11 minutes later. Having broken every speed law in the town, he policed getting there from his house on the North Shore, and walked into a lobby that looked like a federal training exercise. Tactical vehicles in his lot, his desk sergeant standing rigid, a judge, an actual sitting federal judge, being escorted out by armed deputy marshals, and Wade Pruitt standing against the wall, looking like a man watching the last 15 years of his career evaporate in real time. "What in God's name is happening in my department?" Kessler demanded. Priyanandan turned to face him without hurry. "Chief Kessler, your officer unlawfully detained a sitting circuit judge and confiscated his federal credentials rather than acknowledge them. That alone is a serious federal matter. But it has prompted us to take a closer look at this department's operations more broadly, starting with your civil forfeiture numbers over the last 5 years, which, I'll note, are extraordinary for a town this size." Kessler's face went the color of old paper. That's a completely separate issue. That has nothing to do with tonight. We'll be the judge of that," Odom said, and there was nothing in her tone that suggested she was joking. "Starting tomorrow morning. This department is the subject of a federal civil rights and public corruption review. I'd get comfortable with the idea of cooperating fully, Chief, because the alternative is considerably worse." Judge Ellison, walking toward the door, flanked by 2 deputy marshals, paused beside Kessler just long enough to say, in the same level voice he'd used all night, "You built something here that depended entirely on nobody ever looking closely. Tonight, a great many people are about to look very closely indeed." He walked out into the cool night air, past the tactical vehicles, past the small knot of federal agents securing the perimeter of a department that no longer had any illusions about its own permanence, and did not look back. The Federal Review moved with the speed reserved for cases that could not be allowed to look slow. Within 72 hours, FBI forensic accountants had pulled 5 years of Cedar Hollow PD's asset forfeiture filings and cross-referenced them against Hutchins Towing and Salvage's auction records. And the pattern that emerged was not subtle vehicles seized on flimsy pretext. Forfeiture orders signed within hours by the town's part-time magistrate, Justice of the Peace, Verna Sadler, and a suspiciously consistent flow of consulting fees from Hutchins Towing into an account that traced, through 2 shell layers, back to Chief Kessler's brother-in-law. Deputy Marshal Odom sat in on the interview when Officer Pruitt, stripped of his badge and facing federal civil rights charges, was brought in for questioning 3 days after the arrest. He was a different man in that chair than he had been in the lobby, smaller, grayer. The bravado entirely burned out of him. "You had the identification in your hand," the FBI agent across from him said, sliding a photograph of the leather ID case across the table. "Explain to me why a 15-year veteran doesn't run a name the second he sees federal credentials." I thought Pruitt started again. I'd made up my mind about him before I ever got out of the car. Once I'd made the call in my head, nothing was going to change it. Not even the badge. "That's the most honest thing you've said all week," the agent replied, and closed the folder. Justice of the Peace Verna Sadler did not fare any better. When federal agents arrived at her modest courthouse office with a search warrant 2 days later, she was found attempting to feed a stack of forfeiture case files into a shredder that had jammed halfway through the job. Under questioning, faced with bank records showing a decade of unexplained deposits timed suspiciously close to every major Hutchins towing auction, she folded within the hour, and named Chief Kessler as the architect of an arrangement that had, by the department's own sloppy internal accounting, moved north of $2 million through seized property over 5 years. He told us it was for the town, Sadler said, staring at the table. Equipment, salaries, keeping the tax rate down for the people who actually live here. I told myself that made it different from stealing. I don't believe that anymore. Chief Kessler, when his own turn in the interview room came, tried the oldest play in the book, throw the officer under the bus, insist the operation had been Pruitt's alone, plead total ignorance of the towing arrangement, despite his own signature appearing on 11 internal transfer authorizations. It did not work. Federal prosecutors had, by that point, assembled a paper trail thick enough that Kessler's denials read less like a defense and more like a confession delivered in the wrong tense. You signed the transfer orders yourself, Chief. The lead FBI forensic accountant said, laying 11 pages across the table one at a time, each bearing Kessler's own looping signature at the bottom, 11 times. That's not an officer going rogue. That's a chief running a business. It kept the tax rate down, Kessler said, for what felt to the agents in the room like the 40th time that week. As though repetition might eventually make the sentence sound less like a confession. Nobody complained when their taxes stayed low. Nobody complained. The agent replied, because the people you took the money from were mostly passing through and mostly couldn't afford a lawyer to fight a forfeiture case in a magistrate's court that never once ruled against your department in 5 years. That's not the absence of a victim, Chief. That's a victim with no way to be heard. Officer Dana Whitlock, for her part, was not charged with anything. The U.S. Attorney's Office made a point, in a rare public statement, of distinguishing between officers who had participated in the department's schemes and the one officer who had told the truth the moment federal investigators walked through the door. She testified before the grand jury 3 weeks later, then resigned before the state legislature could formally dissolve what remained of the department, and took a position with the county sheriff's office the following spring, in a division that, pointedly, had nothing to do with traffic enforcement. She kept, framed on her desk, a business card Deputy Marshal Odom had pressed into her hand on her way out of the station that first night, with a single line written on the back, "The truth doesn't need permission. G. O. Mayor Diane Farrow," who had spent a decade quietly enjoying the low tax rate Kessler's forfeiture program made possible, without ever asking too many questions about where the money actually came from. Tried to hold a press conference on the courthouse steps 3 days after the arrests. Flanked by a visibly nervous town council, she got as far as the allegations against Chief Kessler are deeply troubling to this administration, before an FBI agent stepped through the crowd of reporters. Served her personally with a subpoena for the town's general fund records. And the press conference dissolved into the kind of chaos that made the 6 o'clock news in 3 states. 6 months later, the outcome was a sweep that redrew the map of Cedar Hollow's civic life entirely. The state legislature, reviewing the county's petition in the wake of the federal indictments, voted to revoke Cedar Hollow's independent municipal charter and folded its policing entirely into the county sheriff's department. The station house, the same brick building where Marcus Ellison had sat in a holding cell with his wrists aching, was sold at federal auction and converted, in a piece of irony nobody in town failed to notice, into a legal aid clinic serving low-income residents of the county. Chief Roy Kessler was sentenced to 19 years for racketeering, wire fraud, and civil rights violations under color of law. Justice of the Peace Verna Sadler, who cooperated fully once the shredder jammed on her, received 6 years, reduced from what prosecutors had originally sought. Bo Hutchins, the cousin who had turned a modest towing yard into a $2 million laundering operation, took a plea and forfeited the business entirely. Its assets liquidated and the proceeds redirected into a restitution fund for the department's victims. It was the sentencing of Wade Pruitt that drew the most attention. In a courtroom packed to standing room with reporters, and, in the front row, the family of Elena and Marcus Alvarez, whose 16-foot fishing boat had been seized on a pretextual DUI stop 2 years earlier and auctioned within a month. The family never given a real chance to contest it in court. The Alvarez family had spent 18 months fighting to get so much as a hearing before Sadler's magistrate court quietly buried their case. And it was only the federal review triggered, ultimately, by one officer's decision to arrest a judge rather than read what was in his own hand that had surfaced their file at all. Their restitution check, funded from the liquidation of Hutchins Towing, had been mailed the week before sentencing. Judge Ellison did not attend the sentencing as a spectator. Federal ethics rules would have made that inappropriate even had he wanted to. And he did not particularly want to. He submitted a written victim impact statement instead, 3 paragraphs long, that the federal prosecutor read into the record on his behalf that the damage of a single unlawful stop was never contained to the person stopped, that it radiated outward into every citizen who had ever quietly decided not to fight a department that clearly did not answer to them, and that the true measure of accountability was not what happened to the officer who made the stop, but whether the town built something afterward that could no longer be run the same way. The federal judge presiding over Pruitt's sentencing did not need the statement read twice. You held proof of your own error in your hand, the judge said, looking down at Pruitt from the bench. And you chose your pride over the truth. That choice did not just cost you your career, Mr. Pruitt. It exposed a machine that had been quietly grinding up people with far less power than the man you happened to stop that night. People who never got the chance to make a phone call that brought the United States Marshals Service to their door. I sentence you to 11 years in federal prison for deprivation of rights under color of law. Pruitt did not look back at the gallery as the marshals led him out, on a clear October morning. 13 months after the night he had sat in a Cedar Hollow holding cell with his wrists bruised and his ID confiscated. Marcus Ellison drove his silver Lincoln down Lakeshore Drive again. Windows down. The lake throwing back a hard, bright light through the cedars. The house was finished now, his wife's garden coming in along the south fence. A new dock, replacing the rotted one that had come with the property, and there were no lights in his rearview mirror. No cruiser idling at the mouth of the street. There was only the quiet, unhurried hum of a Thursday morning in a town that had, in the end, been forced to become something closer to what it had always claimed to be. He parked in his own driveway, sat for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel, and thought not with anger, which had never been useful to him, but with the same clear-eyed precision he brought to every opinion he had ever written about how close the whole architecture of that machine had come to grinding on forever, simply because no one who mattered had ever been made to stand in the same room and answer for it. Power without accountability does not announce itself. It simply keeps operating, quietly, until someone with nothing left to lose by telling the truth decides not to look away. He got out of the car, walked down toward the new dock, and stood for a while looking out over the water, in no hurry at all. If a story like this reminds you why accountability matters, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes nobody should be above the law. And subscribe for more true-to-life stories of justice finally catching up. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Judge Ellison's position?